officers and members, and welcome to this Development Control Committee meeting on the 2nd of July. The first thing I must do is read out the fire evacuation procedures. There are no fire alarms scheduled for this evening. Therefore, if the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately. The fire exits are located at the rear and the side of this room. You go down the stairs and meet in the War Memorial Park. Further, please note that this meeting is being webcast live on the internet, and it takes in both the seats for the public speakers and councillors who speak. And finally, I request that you turn off your mobile phones and public speakers or turn them to silent. Thank you. For the benefit of the members of the public attending, I would like to explain who everybody is round this table. I'm Councillor Donald Sherlock, and I'm the chairman of this committee, and this is Anne Court, vice chairman. And down the sides of the table to the left and right are the councillors who sit in the committee and who will be making the decision, and immediately to my right and left are the officers who will be advising councillors. In the back under the windows are those councillors who are not on the committee but have asked to present their views, as well as additional officers who may be called upon to help councillors. In addition, I'd like to explain that the Development Control Committee is a regulatory committee and not a political meeting. The committee will be looking at the evidence brought before us tonight and will make a decision based on planning reasons. We are guided by national and local planning guidance and policy, and I understand that planning can be emotive, and I ask that everyone remains polite and professional throughout the evening. And may I ask all speakers, including visiting members, to speak clearly and to return to their seats once their presentation is complete. No further dialogue between members of the committee and speakers will be permitted once questioning has finished. And may I ask all committee members to avoid repetition, and I ask members to keep any comments on each item to a maximum of 4 minutes, if you would, please. Thank you. Right. Apologies for absence and substitutions. None? No?
Apologies for absence of Eric Dunlop.
Thank you for that. Right, noted. Any declarations of interest?
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to declare a non-pecuniary personal interest in item number 3.
Excellent, thank you. Right, any urgent matters? Nope. Minutes of the committee meeting held on the 4th of June. Are you happy, members, that I sign these as true? Thank you. And with that, we move to paper 1 on the agenda. This is Riverside View, Basing Road, Old Basing, Hampshire, for a development of 24 two-bedroom apartments, and officers will make a presentation, and we will then have public speaking.
Thank you, Chairman. The application is for the demolition of the existing office buildings on site and the redevelopment of the site with 24 two-bedroom apartments and associated parking and cycle storage at the site Riverside View, Basing Road, Old Basing. If I could draw members' attention to the update paper, it confirms the tree officer comments following amended drawings, confirms the biodiversity officer comments on additional information submitted in the respect of biodiversity, discusses the now proposed footpath, confirms the details of the viewing panel, confirms no objection from the Crime Prevention Design Advisor, and provides details of amended and additional tree and ecology reasons for refusal. Thank you, Chairman. Oh, sorry, the recommendation is for refusal as per the agenda. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you for that. Now, I have 3 objectors and 2 in support, and I would ask the objectors to come up, Mr. Rennick, Mr. Stevens, and Mr. Lane. To the chair, sir, you've only got two, I'm afraid. You have to bring one with you. Oh, there's only two of you anyway.
I'm here, but I'm not speaking.
Right, excellent, thank you. You have 4 minutes between you. I will give you a warning when there's 1 minute to go, and to start off the microphone, you press the long bar, black bar in the middle, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The site lies in a countryside location within the old Basing Conservation Area. That must be the biggest objection. You don't build a high-density complex of 24 flats in a conservation area. The case officer's excellent report highlights the problems. They are not a sustainable form of development. The development would create significant urbanization. The development would adversely affect the setting of an important group of designated heritage sites and of the conservation area. The design and layout of the development are considered to be unacceptable with insufficient amenity space. The development would require the loss of broadleaf, woodland, and important protected trees to construct the buildings and parking. The site has been used as a landfill site. Risk from contamination is high. There is concern about Basing wood and fen site, key habitats, biodiversity, and possible risk of flooding. The applicant says he cannot provide any affordable housing on site. The parish council disputes this. Turning to the footpath which is needed along Basing Road, in 2009, Hampshire County Council said a footpath from the river to the railway bridge would cost £234,000, including a separate footbridge across the river. We ask, would the applicant fund this? Regarding the parish council has objected to this application.
Good evening. I work for a company which leases premises on this site. We believe the site is economically viable, providing employment in the parish, and we've offered to sign a long lease for all the buildings to give the applicant secure income. On a noise point, I would point out that any residents in the flats would have significant noise. The noise readings you have before you are based on ground level readings, not at the noisy first floor level where open windows in the first floor bedrooms would be situated. We don't believe, therefore, that's a true reading. On pollution, the current development is mainly single story with Velux windows. The proposal is for 3 times the volume. At present, the development is 49 metres from the river. The new development is 20 metres from the river. I believe, as a resident of Old Basing for 45 years, the noise and pollution from the light from 24 flats at night time will be significant. Currently, the offices are unoccupied at night time, so the surroundings are unaffected by the buildings, shielded by the trees in the summer, and in darkness in the winter. The walk along that very important riverbank would be destroyed by these flats.
If I might summarise, Mr. Chairman.
1 minute to go.
The case officer says the proposal would be an overdevelopment of the site, and that the proposed buildings would be an incongruous and inappropriate insertion into the conservation area. English Heritage objects to the application. The proposals would impact upon 2 significant heritage sites. The council's highways officer says the proposal is unacceptable. In conclusion, the conservation area appraisal says this: having designated the conservation area, the local authority has a statutory duty to ensure that those elements that form its particular character or appearance should be preserved or enhanced, especially when considering planning applications. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, beautifully timed. Now, you just remain there while I ask members, have you got any questions? Councillor Potter.
Hello, Mr. Rennick. I just wanted to be absolutely clear, and mainly the officer's advice on this as well regarding the conservation area. I mean, the Old Basing Parish Council is very clear, is it, that this is in the conservation area, from my analysis, it seemed to me it was right on the boundary and could have perhaps been described as being outside of it, but can you be absolutely clear about that, please, first of all?
May I respond?
Yes, please do.
Thank you. Am I allowed to brandish the map of the conservation area, Chairman? I have the conservation area document here. I think it's up to date.
Well, the question is
The site is within the conservation area.
that was the question, wasn't it? Yeah, carry on, Councillor Potter.
Just one more, if I may. Obviously, I've seen the commentary from the Parish Council about the need for affordable housing. Our advice, obviously, is that the analysis made by the council's housing officer is that there's about 670 households identified as being in some form of housing need in Old Basing, significant need for 1 and 2 bedroom units. Is that something which you concur with? Is that your understanding of the housing needs of the Basing residents as you currently understand them?
Speaking personally, Chairman, I couldn't agree or disagree with those figures because I don't have enough background on that particular issue.
Thank you. Any more questions, members? Okay, thank you both very much indeed. Oh, Mr. Bingham and Mr. Lowry, please. You have 4 minutes between you. I'll give you 1 minute's notice. And you press the long black bar on the thing.
Thank you. Thank you. I think a good starting point on this is to try and assess the principle of the development that's before you today. This development has come forward under your local plan policy D9, which relates to rural brownfield sites. And it, in brief, advises that as an exception to normal planning policies on development in the countryside, proposals for the use of brownfield sites in sustainable locations outside of settlement policy boundaries for the development of a range of uses, including housing, will be permitted where it complies with other policies. The committee report suggests that this is a unsustainable location, yet if you read through it, it does talk about policy D9 fairly briefly, where it's confirmed by planning policy officers that the application site is policy D9 compliant and therefore, under the terms of that policy, sustainable and as such a sustainable location. The application seems to have fallen down on the fact that a very small percentage of the site is outside of the established brownfield area, as the council would see it. Our estimation, less than 5% of the total site. Part of the site the council considered to be outside of the brownfield area of the site already has storage units on it and a live planning permission for a fourth office building that has not yet been implemented but could be at any time. Our assertion is therefore that this is a sustainable location for development, contrary to the views expressed in the committee report. Members will probably be aware of the National Planning Policy Framework and the phrase that probably pops up quite a lot about a presumption in favour of sustainable development. And I think that's our starting point as a principle for where we are here. I'm aware, obviously, there's a number of issues being raised in the committee report. I would say, I mean, quite a lot of these are subjective points of view, you know, the scale, design, impact on the conservation area, that kind of thing. I know members have visited the site, so I'm sure you have your own views on these issues, and I don't propose to go on about those at this time. But I will confirm that I believe the site to be quite well enclosed by existing landscaping, and we are committed to a landscape management plan which will come through a Section 106 agreement, which can help further screen the site from the surroundings. Regarding the Section 106, there is a draft in place, and we are awaiting further input from the council as to the level of financial contributions required. As soon as we get all that, we are absolutely happy to sign that and pay the necessary contributions.
1 minute to go.
The Section 106 will also include a commitment for a new public footpath along Basing Road to be constructed before any development takes place. So in summary, I deem the site to be a sustainable location that fully complies with policy D9 of your local plan, as well as the national planning policy framework. The site is well enclosed already and can be enhanced with appropriate landscaping to be agreed. There is insufficient housing land supply in the borough of Basingstoke. This will make an important contribution to meeting housing shortages in Old Basing and provide a development of much needed smaller homes that could suit both first-time buyers or perhaps those looking to downsize from larger properties. Thank you.
Thank you. And just so if you just wait there while members do have some questions.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just ask you, you mentioned or you confirmed what's on page 28 about the willingness of the applicant to put in this public footpath which we need along that section of it. Could you just, you didn't actually mention it, but can you just verify that it would be, if approval were given, it would be up to the standards required by the Hampshire Highways authorities? Thank you.
Well, I mean, we've had dialogue with your highways officer, and we have confirmed our commitment to provide a footpath that complies with Hampshire County Council standards, and that would be our intention to be agreed through appropriate wording in the legal agreement.
So carry on.
Can I just ask Mr. Lowry? I mean, you will be aware, Mr. Lowry, that we've had earlier on this year, we had 5 weeks of horrendous flooding in Buckskin and along the land opposite the leisure centre. You are, like myself, you are very close to the Loddon. Was there any indication that there might ever be any danger of flooding whatsoever?
Mr. Chairman, we've been resident on site for 30 years. Throughout that time, we haven't had any flooding at all. Furthermore, if this proposal went forward, because we are proposing within the development for rainwater catchment and recycling of rainwater, the effect is that it would actually reduce the risk even further. But in answer to the member's question, no, we haven't had any flooding in the last 30 years.
Thank you. Any more questions? Councillor Potter.
Thank you, Chairman. Hello, Mr. Bingham and Mr. Larry. I want to talk to you, if I may, about the affordable housing aspect of this application, which personally I'm particularly interested in. As you all know, our developing draft local plan has as one of its conditions, prerequisites, the 40% housing provision. Perhaps this is something I'll say later on as well, Chair, if I may, within any debate, but I mean, we're all, it seems to me, as a Development Control Committee, at a bit of a loss because we're provided with summary comments just saying that the scheme's been appraised by an independent assessor and she or he has concluded the scheme cannot support any contribution towards affordable housing and still remain viable. But we don't see the books, despite what I thought was an open book approach on these sort of things. So it's difficult for me to make any calculation. But it does seem to me that a simple response from the developer saying we can't afford to provide affordable housing isn't good enough. And clearly there's a demand for this, and the Parish Council has said just that. And it seems to me this application fails significantly by not providing that affordable housing. Are you really saying you can't afford to do the scheme if it has any affordable housing contained within it?
I understand that affordable housing, particularly locally and nationwide, is a very important, very topical, dare I say, issue. We are a small family business. We're a local business. At the moment, the Section 106 is yet to be agreed, entered into. And we could, within that agreement, have a contribution towards affordable housing. But let me be quite frank and point out to the members, we are this small company. We're not a national large-scale developer that's looking for ways to maximise shareholders' returns by trying to avoid the provision of affordable housing. The site is a difficult site to develop if these proposals were approved. And the costs of developing the site in terms of the foundation costs are such that the findings of the independent consultant that was commissioned by the borough actually bear this out to be non-viable. Nevertheless, being a local business, I also feel very strongly that there should be some sort of contribution in terms of affordable housing to go together with the rest of the contributions that we're being asked to provide, including the footpath along Basing Road. I hope, Mr. Chairman, that answers the question.
Thank you. Councillor Goodison.
Thank you, Chair. With respect, Mr. Lowry, you appear to be dancing round that particular question. So I'll ask you a direct question. If it were a condition of approval that you should make a significant contribution towards affordable housing over and above what might be expected under a 106 agreement, would you be willing to make such a contribution? And obviously we can't discuss contributions here, but if approval were given, it could be given with an agreement that officers would need to be satisfied that the contribution that you were offering was a reasonable one in the circumstances. So would you be willing to make such a commitment? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I would on behalf of my company. I think the point of the answer I gave, was really to demonstrate that we haven't got a bottomless pit like some of the large developers have up and down the country. We've been in business for 35 years. In this town, we've seen 3 recessions. And we've managed to continue to keep our employees in work throughout that time. Whilst we have said that it's difficult to make the scheme viable from the point of view that affordable housing we can't afford, I'm saying that, bearing in mind our local connections, that we would agree. Obviously something that needs to be negotiated, but we would agree to a contribution for affordable housing.
Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you both. Right, members, questions to officers. Do I have any questions for the officers? Do we have a question about this affordable housing? Councillor Tomlin.
Sorry, Chair, I have a question to the officers, but not about affordable housing.
Have you got a question? Right.
Thank you, Chair. Officers, what level of affordable housing do you think we can actually get from this site? You know, what should be levied? What sort of percentage, please?
I think if I could just say that the application is not for affordable housing. I mean, the application put forward does not include any affordable housing. So the offer that's just been put forward isn't one that is commensurate with the application, hasn't been consulted on or notified to third parties. So it's not something that I personally think should be produced as an amendment to the application at this stage through representations at the committee.
Thank you. Councillor Goodson.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think there's any purpose in or anything to be gained by sort of pursuing this discussion at this time. I'm merely suggesting that or asking, would it if approval were given, would it be reasonable to place a condition, a legal agreement condition on the 106 contributions to the effect that a contribution which was satisfactory to the borough officers and without them being satisfied the approval would be negated? Would it be possible, you know, for such an agreement to take place? Thank you.
I think I've refer back to my previous answer that it's not part of the application, so it wouldn't be reasonable to secure that as part of a legal agreement where it did not form part of the application.
With respect, I would only make the observation that it's up to the committee to impose conditions should they wish to do so, you know, on an application. I'm merely asking whether the committee could reasonably request that such a condition be placed on any possible approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Gosden, for the question. I think the issue here is that effectively the condition, if committee were minded to go down that route, would effectively materially change the application so significantly that it would in effect be a new proposal, you know, something which brings forward an entirely new dimension in terms of affordable housing provision would be a material change to the application. And I think in this particular instance, bearing in mind there's a viability statement that's already submitted to say that affordable housing cannot be provided, if the committee were minded to approve but then say, well, actually we'd like a contribution of sorts, I think that would have to go back through the viability test as well. So I think there's sort of two dimensions to this, but I would agree with Mr. Chapman's point that effectively the application as submitted, irrespective of the sort of verbal representations made just now, is for non-affordable housing supported by a viability statement.
Councillor Frankham.
Thank you. My question to the officers. I was reading through the update papers in the hope that somewhere in the updates there would be a bit more up-to-date information. For instance, they were saying there's insufficient outdoor amenity. Has anything changed there? They've talked about there's no plans to show the location of underground services. Has that been updated? That includes the drainage, electricity, etc. And I'm just wondering, I seem to be looking through the update papers and quite often it's coming and saying that information's not up to date, and it's not really good for us as a committee to be able to make a decision on a large planning application such as this when there's a lot of information seems to still be required.
Thank you, Chairman. In terms of the two aspects, amenity space, no, there haven't been any changes from the application as originally submitted in respect of amenity space. And in terms of the underground services, that detail hasn't been provided. I think it is information that certainly the tree officer would like to see, but it hasn't been provided yet.
You can.
That was only just a couple of the things. There are other things about the trees, about the bats. There's quite a lot through the report. It's a very long update, so it's very difficult to spend the time actually reading through the detail. But I'm highlighting through, and I keep on highlighting insufficient evidence, insufficient knowledge. I'm very, very concerned. I could not agree to this planning application on these terms. It's just beggars belief. And when it comes to debate, I've got further things to say.
This is questions. Any more questions to officers? Councillor Tomlin.
Thank you, Chair. It was just one on highways, whether there's been any update with your concerns over the entrance and white van man having to reverse back out into the road because of the gates. Is there anything more to say?
No, at the present time, there's no further information to demonstrate that the gates would be operating in a way which wouldn't cause a issue with highway safety.
Any more questions? Then let us go into debate. Councillor Frankham.
Thank you. I know quite often I go against the officers, but this time I absolutely, totally agree with the officers, and this application should be refused. I'll go as far as to propose refusal. I'm very concerned when in the report we've got things like it wouldn't be safe to expect children of 8 and over to safely access the Barton's Mill. There's not enough, insufficient amenity space. As I said before, no plans to show the location of the underground services. I understand, and loss of protected trees. I understand that it's a small business and we all want to see Basingstoke grow because we've got a lot of development and we need jobs for the people that want the jobs. But this small business would go into housing, providing more housing and doing away with more small business. I agree, it may be a small business, but they will be a big impact on the even smaller businesses that are trying to grow that are there now. And the buildings are only 9 years old. I just feel that this whole application is completely wrong in so many fronts.
Thank you. Councillor Tucker. Sorry. Councillor Goodison goes first. He's a ward councillor. I'm sorry, that's my mistake.
No, thank you, Chair. Get the feeling I'm walking uphill on this one, but I will say my piece. I would like to make one or two points, if I may. But firstly, and people who were able to go on the viewing panel will have formed an opinion on this, but my own view is that this is a brownfield site. There are no residences on it. It's 2 office blocks, and short, maybe another 2 office blocks coming. So I mean, it is a brownfield site, and an MPPF, which is the senior planning document at this moment in time, does suggest that there should be a presumption in favour of approval on these sort of sites. So that's the first comment I'd like to make. Of those people who were able to go on the viewing panel, I would like to ask them whether they feel that the impact on the conservation area, were this development to go ahead, would be any worse than the current impact with those office premises which are there at the moment. My own view is that the impact wouldn't be any worse. And then we get on to this interesting question about the implication is that there might be some flooding problem. I mean, I can assure you that ever since Basingstoke was built and the River Loddon was capped, thereby restricting the flow of water down the River Loddon into Basing, we have a situation in which Buckskin gets flooded, not Basing. It is not possible under any circumstances whatsoever for any part of Basing to flood from the river, From rainwater, maybe, but not from the river. It all ends up in Buckskin. Poor old Buckskin. But you know, it's also, there's a question, I would question whether this is, the implication is this is not a sustainable location. One could argue, I think, quite reasonably, that this is a classic example of a site, you know, that is very sustainable because it doesn't necessarily mean you've got to have a car. I mean, there is a cycle and public footpath which has been designated by the borough, which goes from Chinham all down through Lichfield and Basing, down the Basing Road and into East Strop and into town. And the only section which doesn't, where the footpath doesn't exist at this moment in time, is that little section between Grange Farm and the Swing Swang Bridge. And under this, were approval to be given, I think we can safely say that at least half of that footpath, you know, would get built. So it's very, in my view, it's perfectly sustainable because people can walk to work into town, go shopping in Chinham or anywhere else, you know, without a car. I mean, it's only right and proper that I should mention that my parish council were opposed to this development, and I would mention that their three reasons for opposing it were: one, the question of the footpath, which I believe has been identified; secondly, the absence of any affordable housing, and I sympathise with the parish council on that one, because I think we all feel that it's irritating the way developers manage to avoid their commitment to provide affordable housing. And I would hope that the arrangements which might be made for a contribution to go to affordable housing somewhere else might address that. And the third reason for the parish council objecting was the flooding issue. And really, to be honest, there is no flooding issue. I mean, it would have been flooded at the beginning of this year when we had week after week after week of torrential rain, and the river, I can confirm that the river, which is normally 3 inches deep outside my house, you know, went up another 2 inches, and that's all. So I do feel that, you know, that we desperately need houses, and this is a site which could take 24 flats without too adverse an impact, you know, on the local community. So I'm not willing at this point to recommend approval. I'll wait and see what everybody else has to say about it. But I would suggest that there are good reasons for approving this, in the view of the fact that we have no 5-year land supply. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Now, Councillor Tucker, followed by Councillor Taylor, followed by Councillor Frost.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Basically, as I understand it, Councillor Mrs. Frankham has actually moved refusal. I would like to second that, because I think the report has been very, very well written by the officers and covered everything. There's only one thing about sustainability. I look at something like this and think, if there were flats there, would I like to sleep with the railway going right beside my ear, which is pretty well what you have there. And at night, I don't think it's on. I think that comes under the sustainability bit as well.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say that I do have some sympathy with Councillor Godison. It is a brownfield site, and we are looking for sites for housing, and he's convinced me about the flooding issue. There are one or two reasons for refusal that I think we could happily deal with. For instance, as we've mentioned, sustainability is always a very grey area. Possibly the impact on Basing House is questionable. But there are several reasons that I think at the moment are insurmountable. One is that clearly the design isn't of a high enough standard, and I think that's really important. I think Old Basing is a very important village in our borough, and we do have to, well, we have to be careful wherever we build housing in our borough that it's of a good standard of design. There's no provision for affordable housing, and I don't think the offer that we just heard is significant. Well, it isn't it isn't detailed enough for us to know what we're dealing with, so we do need to have more detail on that. The contamination risk seems to be quite a serious one. There's obviously not been adequately assessed, and also the loss of important woodland. So for those, what I consider insurmountable reasons at this time, I would support refusal.
Thank you. Councillor Frost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concerns here are obviously regarding the flooding as per the report, but again, Councillor, I am minded to accept your explanation, not having lived in Old Basin myself, and obviously you are the expert in the ward, so my mind is set at some rest there. But obviously, you know, the impact on the Grange Farm and the barn and the Old Basing house structure, I think does need to be explored more. The one thing that I really just can't get over is the lack of affordable housing, and I do really think that that needs to be severely looked at. And I agree with Councillor Potter in his comments that we should be building you know, more affordable housing. I also think that the traffic area on that particular stretch of road between the bridge and a blind corner, I think also needs some work. So again, unfortunately, you know, I've come here very open-minded, but I haven't heard anything to move my opinion, and I too will be supporting refusal of this application.
Thank you. Councillor Bound.
Yeah, very briefly, Chair. I found Councillor Godson's argument quite persuasive, but not quite persuasive enough. In that it is for me, it's the lack of the affordable housing. Right, there's no way that I can vote for approval on this site.
Thank you. Right, I have a proposer and a seconder that the application be refused. Those in favour? Those against? The motion is carried. Officers, will you?
Thank you, Chairman. The application has been refused, subject to the reasons in the report and in the update paper. Thank you.
Right, we move to item number 2 now, land north of Bushes Farm, Bushes Copse at Oakley. And officer's presentation, please.
Thank you, Chairman. The application is for the erection of an agricultural grain store with hard standing and the creation of a vehicular access. The application is retrospective, and the site is at land north of Bushes Farm, Bushes Copse in Oakley. There is an update paper which confirms no objection from the rights of way officer, and that no additional comments from Oakley and Dean Parish Council have been received, or from the Open Space Society or the Ramblers. It makes a correction to the text of the agenda, gives details of the viewing panel held at the site, and includes an additional condition and note as advised by the rights of way officer. The recommendation is for approval, subject to the conditions listed in the agenda and the amended condition in the update paper. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Greg. I have one speaker, Mr. Smallman. Would you like to come forward? Thank you very much. You will have 4 minutes, and I'll tell you when there's one left.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Smallman. I'm here on behalf of the applicant, Mr. Raymond, who is the farmer. I'm really here just to answer any questions that you may have and to support the planning officer's, I thought, very good, well-balanced report. Just one or two observations I have, though, and by way of a bit of background information, Mr. Raymond is Mr. Raymond operates a major farming business in this part of the world, both in the borough and in Tess Valley, from a centre at Steventon. He acquired the land at Bushes in 2009, he bought it as bare land. As I understand it, the historic buildings that were associated with this block of land have since been redeveloped for housing, but that was nothing to do with Mr. Raymond. He bought 180 acres of arable farmland. That was in 2009, and there was an urgent requirement for a grain store to serve the needs of that block of land. And so he applied, he submitted a prior notification application to erect a grain store under permitted development rights. That was approved, and he got on urgently, so the building was erected in time for the harvest in 2009 to erect the building. As members will have seen who were on the site view, he didn't build it in the right place. And that was because when he got on the site, he realised there were overhead telegraph poles, which again I think members saw when they were on the site. So he chose to put the building up in a slightly different location so that it was available for that harvest. So as the officers have said, this is now a retrospective planning application. It seems to me that the actual visual impact of the building really has to be considered A, against the requirement for a grain store on this holding, and B, against the comparative impact of the permitted building, and the planning officer's report makes that clear. And I think that when you view it in that way, whilst it is a large utilitarian building, it nevertheless is not inappropriate to the countryside setting. And I actually think that the site that it is now built on is probably better than the site of the building permitted under development, under permitted development, because it is more closely tucked up against the block of woodland to the south. You'll be aware of the proposals for further landscaping of the building to the north. Sorry,
1 minute to go.
Okay, and I think the landscape officer is absolutely right, therefore, when he raises no objection to the proposal on landscape grounds. And equally, the highway officer is right when he raises no objection on highway grounds. I know there's only actually 4 letters of objection. I can't see that any other statutory consultee or any other consultee objects. So I would ask you please to support your officers and support the farming industry and grant planning permission.
Thank you. If you just wait there, I've got questions. Councillor Frost, followed by Councillor Potter.
Thank you,
And
Chair.
Tucker.
Thank you very much for coming along this evening, Mr. Smallman. I just have a couple of questions. First of all, you've answered my questions regarding why it wasn't actually built in the right place, and that's laudable. I can understand that. But you can please explain why, when planning permission was granted for a 24 metre by 18.5 metre by 8.5 metre high building, okay, your client has actually built a 30.5 metre long building by 18.5 metre by 9 metre high building. So he's built a bigger building by some 6 metres larger and half a metre taller. Can you please explain that for me? Thank you.
I said I'm not sure I can. To be fair, Mr. Raymond's actually in Germany at the moment, so he can't be here tonight to explain that. What I do know is that the block of land would yield about 700, 800 tonnes of grain. You'd expect that from this size of arable farmland. And the building which has been built can accommodate about 800 and perhaps up to 900 tonnes of grain. So it's probably the right size building for the holding. The permitted development building was the maximum allowed under permitted development. And I think Mr. Raymond would say that he was so preoccupied in getting a building built under permitted development when he bought the land, so the building was ready for harvest, That's why he went down the permitted development route. But actually, the building that is needed to serve the size of the holding is somewhat larger.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for that answer. But the cynical part of me is minded to think that the application was originally put under permitted development, and then the building was built bigger just to try and get away from it. I do have one further question, and that's regarding the colouring of the building. Could you please explain to me why the silver grey building was actually was chosen when it's actually tucked up against a copse of trees which are dark green? Thank you.
Again, I can't explain the thought process of my client. What I would say about the colour of the building is that, in my view, a grey building in the countryside is A, not untypical, and B, is visually quite recessive. And that when the landscaping that is proposed actually is in part already there matures, the overall visual impact of the building will be acceptable. And that's what your landscape officer concluded as well.
Councillor Potter?
It might be a bit of, tautology on my part, because I think Councillor Frost has covered it in a way. I mean, it is the fact. I mean, certainly this is a lot bigger than the permitted building that was originally approved. It's not a facetious comment on my part, and you may not be able to answer for Mr. Smallman, but as Councillor Frost has said, it just seems to me that, having regard to some of the commentary that's been made about this building, if it was painted dark green, it would blend into the countryside and into the copse behind rather better than it does currently. I mean, the applicant, I think, has expressed a willingness to spend a substantial amount of money on screening, a number of trees to be planted, which will take time, of course, particularly the oaks, I think, which are part of that. But for a fairly immediate fix, it seems to me painting the building a dark green, which is a typical grey in colour building in the countryside, I think, that I see, not that I have a knowledge like some of you here, but would be the answer to this, really, would overcome some of the objections. As you come down the hill, it stands out. It wouldn't stand out if it blended into the copse behind, and that's simply a change of colour, I think, which makes all the difference in those circumstances. Do you think your client would be willing to accept that requirement?
I agree that when you drive down the road, it does appear at the moment to be fairly stark, and there is that view as you're driving on the road, it's directly in front of you. It's the only view, I think, where that is an issue. I wouldn't paint it dark green, personally, because I think dark green can be as conspicuous and as uncharacteristic. But a darker grey or a black even might be a better option if the building does need to change colour, and I'm sure my client would be prepared to do that. Might I suggest that if members are concerned about the colour, a condition is added requiring the colours to be approved by officers in due course. Because I think that there needs to be discussion about, if it's not this colour, then what colour would be the most appropriate.
Councillor Tucker, followed by Councillor Frankham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smallman, interesting what has just been said. I actually live on a farm. It's not my farm, where there's a grain dryer, and it's actually two-tone green, and it's right on the Wayfarers Walk like this, and much more inconspicuous. So I'd like you to bear that one in mind, if you would be so kind. Now, I was trying to understand the logic of just the agricultural or the fields, which I assume is always going to be grain, if it's going to needs to have a grain dryer there. Is the grain for use on his own property, or excuse me, will there be very large grain lorries coming in to take it away?
This is an agricultural building which serves simply the land that it sits on, the 180 acres of arable land that it sits in. There's no question of this being a grain store that other farmers bring grain into. It is simply there to store the grain that comes off of the land. So the process is, after harvest, grain goes into this grain store, and then progressively through the rest of the year, it is exported. And if you see the officer's report, there are details of the vehicle movements associated with the movement of grain from the store to market.
Yes, I mean, when you sell the grain, which is what he's obviously doing, it goes in very, very large lorries. That's the point I was making. I mean, this might be a question for our highways. Can they turn around on site and come out in a forward position?
Well, that's a point that your highway officer has raised a concern about, and we're entirely content to accept a condition requiring the existing manoeuvring area to be extended. It is dealt with in the officer's report.
Councillor Frankham.
Yes, I'd just like to try and understand a little bit about the history. When your client bought the farm, he acquired the farm, the family did, was the plans already on there for the original slightly smaller build, or was that put afterwards? I'm just wondering whether it was your client that did the design, or he bought it with the planning there. I'm not quite sure.
He bought the bare land with no buildings, no permission to put a building on the land. So he bought it with the intention of building a grain store to serve the needs of that block of land. Because he was under time constraints, he wanted the building up in that first harvest. He went down the permitted development route, and then I've explained the reasons why the building he actually built didn't accord with that permitted development approval.
Yes, do please.
Thank you. Because I could understand if that was put there, that was imposed on him, and he needed a larger build. So what you're saying is that was what was approved. He took it under his own decision then to move it and make it bigger. I can understand about the pylons, and yes, I was on the site visit. I can understand the size that's needed. What I can't understand is why you did not ask for that in the first place. It just doesn't sit right with me that you would ask for one and then go bigger. It's almost like taking advantage, when in actual fact what we have to consider is whether we would have approved this as it is, and with certain conditions I may have. I've yet to listen to what the other councillors say on this before I really do form my opinion.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a bit of scepticism about the motives of the landowner and whether he was trying to pull a fast one. I personally don't believe that was the case. I believe that he bought the land with the intention to put a grain store up because he wanted to put it up quickly. Permitted development was the way to go. He then realised he couldn't actually comply with the permitted development because of the telegraph poles, so he's going to have to build it somewhere else. And then he took advantage, in inverted commas, and put a slightly larger building up. But actually, and I think you're right, Councillor, I don't think the motives or the way in which the landowner went about this is really the issue for you. The issue for you is whether this building now is acceptable in planning terms. And my view is that it is. And in making that judgment, I think you have to compare the impact of the existing building against what would have been the impact of the building which was allowed on a permitted development.
Very quick.
Very quickly, I have been on planning for many, many years, and I'm fully aware with retrospective and what my duties are as a councillor.
Councillor Taylor.
Thank you very much. This building's been up for 5 years now, so presumably farm machinery and vehicles have been going there, turning round, coming off in a forward gear quite adequately for some years now.
Yes, it's operating perfectly adequately.
Oh, sorry. Ward councillors. Councillor Taylor, would you like to?
We haven't had questions to officers. I don't know if anybody wants to ask any questions.
Sorry. Sorry, questions to officers. Councillor Potter.
Pursuing the point that I made and trying to make it for a serious reason, and I was impressed by Councillor Tucker's knowledge of the various shades of green, and I'm sure she could help the officers in regard to how this might be formulated, but on a genuine basis. It seemed to me Mr. Small was saying he would talk to his client about the benefits that could flow from painting this building in an appropriate colour. I mean, I have some doubts about black or some of the other things that were being mentioned, but my own subjective view about green, if that was something that we felt as a committee could be asked for, we would be able to do that tonight, would we not? And for the negotiation to take place with the applicant to see what could be deemed eventually to be a suitable colour, would that be okay?
Absolutely, yes. That's the kind of condition that could be imposed with this type of application. I mean, the officer report suggests that that's not necessary here, but if members felt that that was what they would like to impose and needed to impose to make the development acceptable in planning terms, then yes, absolutely, could impose a condition for the colours to be agreed with officers.
Any more questions to officers? Then debate. Ward Councillor, Councillor Taylor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, the appearance of the barn at Bullsbushes Copse has caused concern to many people who feel that with more foresight, its prominence against the backdrop of Bullsbushes Copse could have been greatly reduced. However, we are where we are. I'm keen to support our farmers wherever possible, and I certainly would have no intention of suggesting that any enforcement on removing the barn as being in the wrong position or the wrong size. I wouldn't support that. Especially as its most unpopular feature actually was the light grey material was judged as acceptable by officers when the permission was first asked for. So I do support the officer's recommendation to approve this. In accepting the size and position of the barn, obviously I think we all want to find the best possible way to mitigate its stark appearance. Painting I thought of, I'm a bit nervous about that, to be honest. I bow to people's greater knowledge of what it would look like, but we could be exacerbating it and find that we, I'm no expert in this, and I'm just thinking we could paint it and make it look even worse. In many ways, personally, I think I'd rather keep it because it's a barn-coloured barn, it's a grain store-coloured grain store, but would like to see a really good number of more mature trees mitigating the appearance and softening the starkness of it. And I know that the owner has offered to do that in agreement with our landscape officers, who I'm sure would do the best they possibly could. I'm not convinced that a change in the layout of the entrance is actually necessary. I'm really not. It's quite clear. I'm sure farm vehicles don't have to have hard standing to manoeuvre. I mean, they manoeuvre on all sorts of surfaces. And to lay more concrete on this field just doesn't quite seem necessary to me. It's been happily operating now for 5 years. And, here we are saying got to lay more concrete. I'm not sure personally that that's necessary. And as vehicles exit, there's a large area on the left which they could move onto. It's not concrete, but it's hard. And I think the sight lines are perfectly adequate. If people need to see to the right or to the left, which is actually straight on, so there's very good visibility that way. I accept the applicant's concern that was mentioned when we were on site, that moving the gate might make it easier for flighters to use the land. And so I'd be reluctant to both introduce yet more concrete or move the gate. I think that's almost like taking advantage of a mistake that's been made. The mitigation, though, I would like to hear what others have to say. I'm slightly nervous about the paint, but would love to have the trees. Thank you.
Other ward councillor, followed by Councillor Hood, followed by Councillor Tucker.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, obviously, I think Mr. Smallman answered very truthfully about his client's reasons for doing it, but the cynical part of me does think that we have been taken advantage of. However, having said that, the building is there, it's up and running. I think it's a very good idea to have the trees and the proposed landscaping. Thank you, officers. I would like to see it more developed, though. Okay, so that it really does hide the or mitigate the view of this. I'm not sure about the paint. I don't know whether you'd be able to get away with just painting it. Maybe that'll be okay for a season or two, but after that, then really, I think we've kind of lost it. Yeah, it does chip off. So I'm really in a bit of a quandary here because, you know, whilst I really don't like, you know, the site of the barn there, I think the best we can really do here, it is there, it's a lot bigger than the permitted development. You know, it's some 6 meters bigger and half a meter taller, which is significant. I think we have to accept it's been there for 5 years, and we kind of have to move on. I too, like Councillor Taylor, I'm not a big fan of concreting over the fields around there. I don't think there's been any reports of any issues with traffic, to my knowledge, within the ward. And whilst I'm quite happy to stand corrected, I don't think it would need any further adjustment to the sight lines. So I too reluctantly. I feel that the planning rules have been taken advantage of, but I will be approving this this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hood.
Thank you, Chair. Here's a farmer who decided to build a larger grain store to accommodate the expected yield. He also moved the grain store to avoid telegraph poles. Everything done for a logical reason. I'm not going to be cynical about farmers, having been brought up with farmers. I trust farmers. But I would support this. It's academic now anyway, and I think that everything is being done to suit the needs. And speaking about colouring, well, there's a song, 40 Shades of Green, somewhere, I think, if I remember that. And I'd leave it alone. I'd be quite happy to support this. If it hasn't been moved, I would move it. If it's been moved, I'd second it. I'm happy to support it.
Thank you, Councillor Hood. Councillor Tucker.
Thank you. One thing that slightly worries me about the landscaping that is presently there. Normally when there's landscaping, you have it on a slightly higher land, so that when it grows on a bund, yes, so that it does its job of hiding whatever it's got to hide. When we went round the back of the barn as it is now, it seemed to, because the barn's higher, it then went down, and there were these things planted, the ones that are there at the moment. And it seemed, I felt very sorry for the poor little bushes and things that have got to grow up an extra height to try and hide this very large barn, which, as people have said, it is necessary, etc., etc. The only one thing that still is in the back of my mind, which I think was said on site by the applicant himself, that originally it was a matter of this barn for grain or pigs. But then during the conversation, and I'm sure it was there, somewhere I have seen or have heard that there is a possibility of having another building on site for possibly pigs. And I'm just wondering how that could possibly be accommodated if that is the future, and that's actually what I wanted to ask the agent and unfortunately wasn't able.
Councillor Potter.
Thank you, Chair. I won't push this too far. I mean, obviously, I'm content with the officer's report in all aspects really, except the point that I sought to make. I mean, to be frank, it just seems to me that, in a sense, if we really are content with the building as it is, colour included, I don't know why we're going through the process of saying there should be some landscaping in front of it. It seemed to me what that was seeking to do when it becomes consolidated is to hide the building, make it blend in with the copse behind. So we can't be that satisfied. That's why we're proposing that. And a more immediate way of overcoming that is to have the building painted in a green that is empathetic with that copse behind. But if I don't get support for that, then, you know, the bulk of the report I think is entirely satisfactory. I mean, what I could do, Chairman, with your agreement, is to make my proposal as an amendment really to the officer's recommendation here, and if that's not accepted, then clearly the recommendation stands as it is, end of story really. But I'll pursue the point, if I may, a bit longer, and to put it on record, I haven't got any shares in Dulux.
Thank you, Councillor Potter. Any more? Yes. Councillor Hood, you proposed, who said, and Councillor Potter, you seconded it? No, I haven't got a seconder. No, it's his amendment. I have to deal with the amendment first. So that's seconded. Those.
Could we just ask some expert advice about the feasibility of painting buildings like this so that the paint stays on and it looks good? I mean, do officers know about these things? I just feel I'm shooting in the dark a bit here. I don't want to order something that just isn't going to work.
It is possible to paint this type of building. In terms of the durability and how long it might last, I'm afraid I don't know that answer.
But if it's any help to you, they've just painted all the ones at North Ekeley dark green and they're looking very smart. And the ones down the road are painted and the ones up the road are painted. So there are most farm buildings are painted of this type. Now, the amendment.
So the other thing is, if we're voting on the amended proposal, are members agreed that the improvements and the extra concrete, etc., isn't necessary? We may as well agree with everything all in one go. In other words, to exclude 3, 4, 5 and 6, but to include 9, which is obviously about signage saying be careful as you exit. Is that correct?
From my perspective, having assessed this application with respect to the means of access and the ability for vehicles to turn on site, I'm conscious that as a consequence of this building existing, it will generate non-agricultural traffic, as in road-going lorries to take the grain away from this site. Potentially, those lorries could be, well, there's certainly going to be HGVs and potentially up to full-length articulated vehicles. So really, the purpose of this planning condition, or this selection of planning conditions that are on the paper, is to ensure that those road-going vehicles can be accommodated by this development without interference to the users of the highway. So, for example, the setting back of the gates means that when a lorry arrives, it can pull clear of the highway while waiting for the gates to be opened. And also, there's existing hard standing on the eastern side of the building. That just needs to be extended marginally to take into account the turning circle for those road-going vehicles. Clearly, depending upon the price of grain, those collections could occur at all times of the year, and during times of inclement weather, those road-going vehicles, if they overrun the existing hard standing, are likely to pick up mud, etc., to bring out on the carriageway, which in itself will create a hazard, potentially could freeze in the winter, etc. So I do believe that these planning conditions secure the basic elements that we'd expect of a planning application for an access and a building onto a classified road.
Councillor Frost.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just come back at Mr. Shepherd and saying that the building's been operating for 5 years. We're not actually suggesting it's made any smaller or any bigger. The building's been operating for 5 years. Has the current road suffered, over the past 5 years?
Certainly, the letters of objections cite an increase in vehicles. I don't have the ability to monitor that access on a 365-day basis, but I do need to assess it in accordance with E1 in order to provide safe and convenient access for all users. I believe the amendments that have been negotiated and secure will comply with policy E1.
Sorry, Chair, just a very brief comment as well, just in terms of the comments from the highways officer. I suppose the issue here, and I entirely understand the point being made about the fact that the building's been in use for that period of time, has there been any problems or not. I think the thing to consider as well is that in granting planning permission, it might have been used in a particular way for a period of time. That might change over a period of time as well. So I think the way that the highways officers approach this is to say, well, what could be used on the site, and try and sort of look at it from that perspective, if you like, and then secure conditions to sort of meet those standards.
Thank you. I'm happy to bow to the officer's expertise then, if that's what's necessary. Thank you.
Right. So we are now going to vote on Councillor Potter's amendment. Yes. Good. Thank you. We're happy with that. Those in favour?
Sorry, Chair. Sorry, Councillor Potter. I was under the impression that your amendment was a colour to be decided by the officers, not actually a particular green or a particular colour.
Yes, to be agreed with officers. Yes. We better take the vote again so that we're all clear of what we're talking about. Those in favour? I think that's carried unanimously.
Thank you, Chairman. Confirm that the decision is permission as per the officer report and update paper, with an additional condition in respect of the colour of the building to be agreed in writing with the local planning authority.
Sorry, Chair. Just one thing. Is it possible for officers to come back to us with the colour? Because I would hate for it to be sort of, some obscene colour that yeah, absolutely.
Ward councillors.
Chair, yeah, I mean, Chair, if I can assist with this, I think it's not been unheard of that there's a condition imposed and effectively a note on the file so the permission is granted with that condition. Then when the details come in, that they are discussed with the ward councillors. So it won't be in the condition itself, it'll be a note on the file, if you like.
Right. Remember, let's move to item number 3 now. Longholm, West Heath Road, West Heath, Borghurst, erection of a 3-bedroom dwelling. Officers to present.
Thank you, Chairman. So item 3 is for the erection of 1 3-bedroom dwelling and new vehicle access at Longholm, West Heath Road, West Heath. I'd like to draw members' attention to the update paper, which details the findings of the viewing panel, and it also gives details about the lack of a signed legal agreement at the time of determining the application. The recommendation is for refusal, and an additional reason for refusal relating to the lack of legal agreement has been added.
Thank you. Now I have Mr. V. Haynes for the objectors, and in support Laura Smith and Mr. D. Cripps and Councillor Leake all to speak. And if Mr. Haynes would like to come up. Thank you, Mr. Haynes. You have 4 minutes. I'll give you 1 minute's warning when you're finished. You press the long button.
Thank you, Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to speak, and I welcome the opportunity to speak to the committee on this item. I was first alerted to this application when I received a neighbour notification letter from the council, and subsequently I received a visit from the applicant who informed me that she wished me to support the application and explain all the personal circumstances and the fact that the dwelling was not going to ever be sold. However, that did lead me to have concern regarding the matter. The dwelling, as you will see from the plan before you, or the one that was up there a minute ago, is situated in a rural location, and members who visited the site will have observed that it is in fact a very rural location with just a few dwellings in the locality. This is clearly a countryside site, and the applicant accepts that, and hence the personal circumstances they have presented. However, you will also be aware as a committee that the council has clear planning policies, which are notably policy D6, which is a saved policy from the old local plan, and that policy is in conformity with the national planning policy framework. That policy is that dwellings in isolated rural locations will not normally be acceptable unless required in connection with the needs of the rural economy. Now, you will see in the applicant's case rests on the fact that the dwelling will be occupied by a son and future daughter-in-law who are teachers in a local school. That is clearly not in consistency with the policies applied by this council. And there's no means of regulating the occupation of the dwelling through any conditions. The conditions normally apply to rural dwellings are those, as you will be aware, those which relate to agricultural workers or those employed in forestry. So it is impossible for the council to control occupation and subsequent disposal. I also would also raise the fact that the dwelling is not in a sustainable location. That is, again, not in consistency with the National Planning Policy Framework, which urges development to be sustainable. And also the councillor who referred the application referred to policy SS6. That policy has not been through examination or proper full consultation and should be given very limited weight. The starting point for determination of the application is the development plan, and this policy does not comply necessarily with the NPPF, and that will be subject to future examination. I would also point out that the dwelling, if you look at the criteria of that policy, you also see it's not in conformity to which your officers say.
1 minute to go.
Right, thank you. I would also say that the design of the dwelling is quite incongruous and out of keeping, and I was actually frankly surprised by the design and access statement which the applicant submitted. It was a misleading document and factually didn't relate to the dwelling that was proposed. So I would say congratulations to the officers for an excellent report, and I urge you to support your officers and refuse this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haynes. If you just wait there. Any questions for Mr. Haynes from members? Councillor Potter.
Can I just clarify, Mr. Haynes? I mean, obviously you had the original neighbour notification, as you say. Can I just be clear where you actually live in relation to this site?
If you look on the map, I live in the property.
Oh, sorry, it's...
I live in the property which is to the north. If you see the willows, I'm next door to the willows, which is called Meadowview. There we are. So in very close proximity.
Obviously close proximity, but not overlooking the proposed dwelling. I mean, I don't know about the history of this area, but would yours have been an original countryside site when your dwelling was built originally?
The dwelling, I cannot explain the planning history of this property which I live in, whether that's relevant or not to the consideration before you. The dwellings there, the old Vine was in fact a public house from the records I've seen, and there were a number of outbuildings on the site. This, both the Willows and Meadowview sit in the grounds of the public house, which had a number of outbuildings to the rear, and I've seen photographs of those outbuildings. So it it was not like this site, which is a complete greenfield site. It was in fact a outbuildings and a public house, but that was in 1962, and I don't know what policies were operated by this council with its predecessor rural district at that time.
Just want to check one other thing with you, if I may, really. You're entitled, of course, to quote the officers and also the MPPF where appropriate. In terms of what you describe as the proposal being unsustainable, what do you understand you mean by that, please?
Yes, if you refer to the National Planning Policy Framework, it seeks that dwellings in the countryside, it states that local planners should avoid new isolated dwellings in the countryside unless there are special circumstances. Dwellings in the countryside are unsustainable because of A, their location, the need for reliance on vehicular transport, the fact that they put pressure on the sewage system, etc. So that's why normal planning policies not only seek to prevent the dwellings in the countryside for visual reasons, but there are clear economic reasons why dwellings in the countryside are less economic than dwellings in main settlements.
Any more questions for Mr. Haynes? Thank you, Mr. Haynes. Now, can I have Laura Smith and Mr. D. Cripps, please? You will have 4 minutes between you both, and I'll give you a minute's warning. And you just press the long bar in front of you.
Thank you for considering our planning application and for listening to us today. The proposed 3-bedroom building is for myself and my partner, David Cripps, to live in and build our future family. The land where our home is due to be built is currently owned by John and Colette Cripps, parents of David, and is at the moment part of their garden. You will have seen on your site visit that the house will be well sheltered from the current roads surrounding the plot, so very little of the house will be seen from the roads. In order to build our home, no existing trees will be removed. However, a small portion of the front of the garden hedge will be removed in order to create our driveway. We have tried to keep the design of the house modest and in keeping with the surrounding houses. As the many houses near and around the plot are, in fact, all different in shape, size and design, this was difficult to do. So we have chosen wooden timber cladding on the first floor so that it blends in with the trees and hedges, more so than a red or yellow brick first floor. We were advised by the council that the application would have a less positive outcome if windows were put on the west side of the building and therefore overlooking the bungalow, even though there would be no objection from Mr. and Mrs. Cripps. This is why the roof is designed in this particular manner, in order to allow as much natural light as possible to enter that side of the house in order to comply with the council's wishes. We are willing, however, to consider a more traditional roof shape with Velux type windows in the roof in order to allow light in, and we would accept advice to change the design if necessary. The exterior design of the house is secondary to David and I, as all we want is a chance to build a permanent home for us to spend our lives in and build a family. We aim to build our home as energy efficient as possible. We have decided on the solarium element of the house for 3 reasons. 1, it is a unique feature which will enhance the appearance of the exterior. 2, it will allow us to have views of the outstanding surrounding countryside without seeing anybody and without being seen ourselves due to its southeast location. And 3, it is a way of having more natural light to enter the property in order to keep energy consumption down. David and I are both teachers, key skill workers who are well respected within our local community. David works at the Priory Primary School, 5 minutes from the proposed development. As we cannot afford to buy a house anywhere within the local environment or the surrounding areas, a rejection for this planning proposal will result in a complete upheaval, and for me to leave the village where I have lived for the past 5 years, and for David to leave the home where he has lived all of his life, for 26 years. Another advantage to us staying in the local area is to be in close proximity to look after David's parents as they approach their later years of life. We are very privileged to have this opportunity to build our dream home. We plan to live in the village for the rest of our lives and are looking forward to contributing to the village life, both in the skills and personalities the two of us can offer, and also the youth and enthusiasm our future children and generations can offer. We have already started our contributions to the village by joining the local neighbourhood planning team alongside the parish council.
1 minute to go.
We hope you agree with the points we have raised and approve the planning proposal for our future home and family.
Thank you very much. Members, questions to Mr. Cripps or no? Councillor Bound.
Yes, just one really. I appreciate that you want to stay in the village. I note you're saying that you want to stay there for the rest of your life. Well, that's what I was gathering. Is that a sort of feasible thing? If as a teacher you want to get on, to stay in the area?
Yes, absolutely. David's family have been in the local area for a very long time, haven't they? And it's something. David's a very well-respected teacher within the Priory, and has already, even though he's only been there for 3 years at the moment, has already worked his way up, so to speak, and is planning to continue to do that and to remain in the Priory. He went to primary school there himself, and he's always seen himself as a teacher in that school. Thank you.
Councillor Tucker.
I'm going to be nosy now. Where do you teach?
I teach at the Bramley Church of England Primary School.
Any more questions? Thank you both very much. And now call upon Councillor Leake, please. Four minutes with 1 minute.
Chairman, before I begin, are we all aware that the sound is not very good? And if people are wanting to watch this on the webcast or look at it in the future, they're going to get rather curious sound, I suspect. But just make sure everybody is aware that where we're sitting, the sound is not very good. Can I just make that point?
I wasn't aware, but thank you for telling me. There's not much I can do about it.
I realise that, but maybe somebody could do something about it for the next meeting or whatever. Anyway, can I start now? I brought this application to you because I believe substantial weight should now be given to policies in our revised pre-submission local plan, which has been approved by Council and hopefully has completed its consultation stage. Those of you on the former Planning and Infrastructure Overview Committee will recall that a number of rural members, particularly those representing villages with without a settlement policy boundary, were keen to see that some development was permitted in what the plan calls open countryside, to ensure that our villages were not preserved in aspic, but rather kept alive. We drafted and approved Policy SS6, which sets out the circumstances in which new homes will be permitted. And these are contained in 6 categories, A to F. But they are not sequential, as suggested by the officer on page 54 of his report, but separate and individual. In this case, Clause E applies, which states that residential proposals that have the support of the local parish council will be permitted, provided that they do not result in an isolated form of development, the scale is appropriate to the site and location, the development will respect the local environment and amenities of neighbouring properties, and the development is well related to the existing settlement. The officer is arguing that the site does not have good accessibility to local amenities other than by private car, and is thus not sustainable. That argument would apply to the whole of my ward. There is virtually no public transport. It is also curious to note that if approved, provision would have to be made for the parking of 3 cars and 3 bicycles. Members who attended the viewing will have noted that far from being isolated, it would lie at the centre of the hamlet of West Heath. They will also have seen that dwellings in that area are a broad spectrum of architectural styles. There were only 2 objections relating to loss of amenities, and the officer's report confirms that the proposal would not have any significant impact in terms of overlooking or privacy issues. The officer suggests that the application does not satisfy the special circumstances test, in that the dwelling is not for the use of a rural worker. Clause E of Policy SS6 does not appear to require that test, but in my opinion, the retention of 2 young teachers at local rural schools is just as important as those working in agriculture. I also remind members that earlier this year, this committee approved, contrary to policy, the construction of 3 dwellings in a very isolated area of Church Lane, Wolverton, for, we were told, essential agricultural workers whose job was to process herbs when the advice to council was that those jobs were not essential. The design may not suit everyone, and the applicants have indicated a willingness to modify it.
One minute.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. To a large degree, it was developed based on advice from officers at the pre-application stage, as you have already heard. What I am asking you to do is to approve the principle of development on this site, knowing it has the unanimous support of Wootton St Lawrence Parish Council, and I speak also as a member of the Parish Council, and will keep 2 young members of our community in the village who otherwise may have to move further afield to more affordable areas. As you've heard, David Cripps, one of the applicants, works as a teacher at the highly successful primary school. Please do not let us lose him, nor his partner Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any questions for Councillor Leake? No? Right. Thank you. Questions to officers? Councillor Taylor, followed by
Thank
Councillor
you.
Potter.
Could I just check with officers that Councillor Leake's interpretation of SS6 is correct, that it doesn't have to fulfil all of these requirements, but any of them, any one of them? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I think the issue is one step back from that, which is that it doesn't carry substantial weight at this time. It carries limited weight because it's not been through examination. So while I understand the reference to it and what might be coming down the road, if you like, in future, at this time limited weight can be provided to it. So my advice would actually be that it wouldn't be safe, if you like, to approve an application based on what the policy may or may not say in its final form.
Thank you. That was my next question. Should it be substantial or not? And it is limited. But when it does come in, if it does come in the form that it was agreed, it's any one of these conditions, not all of them.
Councillor, can I just check that on the wording on the website and come back to you?
Councillor Potter.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Taylor's covered the thrust of what I was going to ask about SS6, and I know Mike's just going to refer to the sort of sequential aspect of that. What I just wanted to check, I mean, Councillor Leake was saying, I think, in what he said to the committee about us this evening approving the principle of development on this site as against the actual application that we have in front of us in terms of the detail of the dwelling that's proposed. And there's an inclination, dare I say, at this stage, really, on my part to go with that. I mean, I have to say, I have sympathy with the application, but I don't like the design of the building. I don't know whether they've fallen within 2 stools in terms of trying to come up with some innovative design because of other aspects, but it doesn't meet the sort of subjective tests I'd apply to it. I just wanted to check that out as well, if I might.
It's my understanding that you need to assess the application as it stands in front of you and whether it's acceptable or not. If you think that the design is not acceptable and you agree with the reasons for refusal, then you cannot agree it on the principle of building the dwelling in that location.
Councillor Tucker, followed by Councillor Frost.
Sorry, can I just double check what you're saying? That we couldn't defer it for an amended design, in that we agree the principle of it, but some of us are worried about the design. I would not wish to just pass it with a design that I'm slightly unhappy about just because we can't defer it and let it go forward.
The amendments that would be required to the design in order for it to be considered acceptable would most likely be too fundamental to be considered under the same application. Therefore, an entirely new application would need to be submitted with an amended design, which could then be considered by the committee or officers.
Do you want to ask the supplementary?
Sorry, would they have to, if it were turned down, and they resubmitted a similar but a different design, would they have to pay for a new application?
It would depend on whether they had already had what's called a free go beforehand. In some instances, you are able to resubmit a similar proposal without needing to pay the fee again. I understand that the applicants did seek pre-application advice prior to submitting this application, and they would be entitled to do that again prior to submitting anything. But in terms of whether they'd be able whether they would have to pay anything, you would have to look into the history and see whether they qualified for that, which I can't do at this time.
Councillor Frost, followed by Councillor Frankham.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, you're not. Can we just expand on that?
Sorry, if I just come back on the last point. Just noting that there is no relevant planning history, so that suggests that this is their first application. So if they were to resubmit a scheme that was substantially the same scheme in terms of its description and with the same red edge, it would appear that they could have, as the case officer said, a free go.
Does that answer your question? Councillor Frankham?
Yes, and mine's actually, I'm sorry, I may have missed it, but unfortunately, the air duct is overtaking the sound in my hearing aid, so I'm having a lot of difficulty here. At the site visit, we did ask if they would let us know the sizes of the buildings, because we weren't sure about the surrounding buildings and the relationship, how much bigger this building would be than the other buildings. So has anybody come back and said, I know there's on the updates it's saying about the height of the building compared to the bungalow, but we were asking about just a little bit further down the other houses, was this significantly bigger than the other houses? Would this be the biggest, tallest within that hamlet?
We have not received any additional information about heights of surrounding dwellings, so we are not able to answer that at this time.
Right, I'm sorry, I'm disappointed because we did at the site visit ask specifically that would be brought to this committee, and we're told that they would have a look at that. So I am a bit disappointed because it's something that's very relevant, I think, in a lovely little hamlet like this.
I think, Chair, just on that point, if I may, I mean, certainly the site viewings are obviously designed to take into account the context and the surroundings of the development. It's not always possible to get details of adjoining properties simply because you'd need to actually go and survey them on third party and private land, which you know, as officers we don't have the ability to do. I dare say the applicants might not either. Just coming back to Councillor Taylor's point though, in terms of the emerging policy SS6, each of those points is followed by or, so it's one of those each time. I think the point that Councillor Leake referred to in particular was the local parish town council support for. Again, I would just refer back to my previous comments about limited weight being attached to that at this time. Reason being that simply if it goes to examination, and for argument's sake, the inspector doesn't agree with that particular point, and we can't say with certainty whether he will or will not at this time. You know, if committee were to approve tonight on that ground alone, that may not be the sort of final version of the policy.
Councillor Frankham, do you want to?
Yes, I just wanted to come back. I wasn't expecting somebody to go with a ruler, but I do think that as we as a committee asked, which I understand that we should be doing, for information, that even if an officer had gone there and by sight, because obviously they're a lot more qualified than we are, and come back and said, yes, it is that they are significantly taller. I wasn't expecting somebody to go with a ruler, but I would have liked to have got some idea of the different heights. I'm sure you officers can have a look at a building and say that's 7 meters, that's 9 meters. you've been doing it for long enough. But I just feel I'm quite put out that we make a request and we've been ignored.
So, Chair, I mean, I understand the point Councillor Franklin's making. Yes, we do go out and assess applications and make judgments as to whether something is going to appear significantly tall or not. But I think for us to come back and try and provide some information which says, well, in our opinion, it might be close to 7 metres in itself would possibly mislead the committee, and I wouldn't feel comfortable in taking that approach in future.
Very short sentence. Well, I feel as if I've been misled because we were told we would have that information.
Councillor Bound.
Thank you, Chair. Just to the officers, I'm assuming that there is no tie between Longholm and the proposed new dwelling. So that if David or Laura, for instance, got promotion and decided that they were going to move down to Devon or Cornwall or wherever the promotion took them, then there would be no problem in them actually selling that house on.
Yeah, we wouldn't be able to condition a tie of any sort. So that's right. If they wanted to move, they would be able to move from that property, and somebody else could live there.
Any more questions for Officer Solly? Councillor Tucker.
Can I come back to the clause SS, whatever it is, 6? If we were to pass this using that, if it weren't accepted by the inspector, it wouldn't make any difference to the permission that we've granted, does it?
No, it doesn't at all.
Sorry, just clearing the air. And just one other thing, with regard to heights and things, the one thing that I looked at was the very, very tall trees on the other side of the plot. And I thought, yes, you could put a 2-storey house there. It wouldn't be out of keeping.
Any more questions for officers? No? Right. Can we move into debate then? Do I have any comments from anyone or proposals? Councillor Potter.
I'm not sure about a proposal at this stage, Chairman. Just bear with me. But I mean, I guess I've got a track record, as people know, in seeking to approve such applications, really. And I'm glad to know, I think I know that SS6 is starting to move in my direction, although it's not perfect. And I think it could be better and more relaxed than it is. And people won't agree with me on that, but I do welcome this type of individual, development in the countryside. I think it's realistic in a modern setting. But I have real concerns about the type of design that's been put forward, which I don't consider to be appropriate having regard to the street scene that we saw. I don't quite know how they've ended up coming forward with something like this, which they think is going to be compatible. That's a subjective view, of course, on my part, but I wouldn't feel content, although I support this application in principle, in agreeing it as it stands. And I think the only alternative that I have probably is to go with the officer's recommendation in regard to refusal at this juncture, but for hopefully the applicant to have noted at least my comments tonight. We'll see what other people say and come back with something which is going to be, again, subjectively, in my view, more appropriate to that particular area.
Thank you. Councillor Goodison, followed by Councillor Tucker.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I must admit, I don't have any great problem with the design, so I would be quite happy to recommend approval of the application.
Thank you. Councillor Tucker?
I actually wanted to go along with Councillor Potter. The reason being, unusual as the house design is, you either like it or you don't like it. But what slightly concerned me as we walked along the road, on the opposite side there is this sort of unique thatched cottage that was sitting behind, and something as sort of modern style as this, to me would slightly grate. But I would very much like to have passed it, but I think we've led the way. There's how it could be organised for them to come back with another design.
Councillor Frost.
Thank you, Chair. I've weighed up the report and also listened to what everybody's had to say here, and actually I would like to second Councillor Godstone's motion.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor,
Thank you.
followed by Councillor Tomlin.
Okay, I'm going to go against the flow a bit here, I'm afraid. I mean, obviously, common sense says to me, well, why not? It seems to fit in well, etc., and there's a big plot of land. But in planning terms, we just simply don't have a policy to support it at this time. And I think that's quite dangerous ground to break. And what I don't want to do is encourage parents to buy big houses in the countryside with lots of land and know that they can just build a house for their children. Much so I can appreciate that it sounds sensible. We've got to be careful that our planning policies have a proper control over that sort of thing. And at the moment, as Mike Townsend says, we haven't got approval of it and it hasn't been investigated and examined properly. So I would not approve this simply because at this time we don't have planning policies to support it, and I don't think we should be doing that.
Councillor Tomlin.
Thank you, Chair. There's a couple of points. The first one really is on the point of policy. Is anybody, as we're in debate, remind me how, I think it was a house in, was it in Newnham that we gave planning permission to? It was outside of policy, wasn't it? Or there was no. No, it wasn't a farm, and it was fully. Yeah, we gave. We ended up going to P&I about it as well, didn't we? Yeah, and it wasn't the housing. Oops, sorry, it wasn't the rural question. So I just want to be reminded of the reasons we managed to approve that one. And the second thing was I'm a little bit concerned. If I heard it right, it was probably a belated question to officers, but there was pre-planning consultation. So I'm baffled how we get sort of an applicant coming forward with a design that's not going to fit into somewhere. I mean, I've not been through pre-planning applications personally, so I don't know, but it strikes me, have we misguided somebody, or am I misunderstanding what pre-planning is all about?
The pre-application advice, I've just been informed, was sought in terms of the principle of the development, and the design itself wasn't ever put forward. So I think this is the first time that the design's actually come forward.
All right. Councillor Bound, followed by Councillor Tucker.
Thank you, Chair. I just wonder whether they, if we granted planning permission, could they come back to us then with a change of plan?
No, so effectively the application before you is to be determined. So it's approve or refuse. Chairman, if I may just briefly comment on the potential for approval.
Please do.
Sorry, Chair, just in terms of obviously the motion and second now for approval, again, from previous committees as well, I do understand the approach towards or wanting to be having sympathy, if you like, for villages wanting to expand and individuals wanting to stay in particular locations. The challenge, if you like, for the committee and as officers is to determine applications in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. That's the only way that we can approach these matters. Current development plan sets this outside any assessment policy boundary, therefore there is no in principle support for any residential development that's not required for agricultural uses, so on and so forth. So there are no sort of exceptional circumstances there. I also understand the point being raised by regarding key workers, etc. Again, as the point I think Councillor Bound made, there is nothing that we could do to tie the applicants to the property or tie the property to the land. So from that point of view, in effect, if there was the application was recommended for approval, there would need to be some exceptional circumstances which in essence are the material consideration that outweighs the current development plan policies. That's what the committee members would need to be satisfied, if you like, exist in this particular example.
Councillor Tucker.
Forgive me, I'm being totally stupid. With regard to the pre-app, you said that it was for the principle of, and can you tell me what they were advised?
Yes, they were advised it wouldn't be acceptable. No, it would not.
Right, we have a proposer and seconder for approval of this, I think. Does anybody want to have any more say before we take a vote on it? Councillor Potter.
I mean, it may not be possible, and I don't expect people to try very hard to get me personally, or perhaps Councillor Tucker's with me on this, out of the dilemma we're in. As I said, it's in my nature, as you know, to approve such applications for a lot of reasons I could explain tonight if you needed to. But I just have this concern about the design, which even the officers say, which fits in with mine, would appear to be able to keep it incongruous and have an adverse impact on the street scene. And that's my concern from what we saw. And it seems to me there is no other way, if I'm right, sorry, forgive me, if I'm right about that view, of achieving what I'd like to see without refusing this and asking the applicant to make a fresh application that would achieve something more compatible. If we go for approval, I mean, I think I'll probably abstain, which is out of character with me, really, because I think I have that real dilemma which I'm trying to express. But I think it's sad that we would not be able to find a way through this, really, because I think there is sympathy, a couple of exceptions perhaps, around the table for the principle of this, but some reservations from some of us about that design, and we need to find a way through that, really.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm being a nuisance, I'm sure. It seems to me that there's two choices. If we were to pass it as it is now, knowing that we're not desperately happy about the design of it, perhaps, there would be absolutely nothing to stop them at a later date to come back with further details, having established that something is passed there. I know that Mike's frowning, which always he's forgotten that I keep an eye on him. But if we were to turn it down, there is nothing to stop them coming back again with another design on the same site. Am I right?
Chairman, that's absolutely right. I suppose the issue would be what would be the incentive to do so. I mean, if something's approved and it's ready to build, then there would be no requirement to come back for anything additional. There's nothing that we could put on the approval to say that anything further has to come in.
Right, I have a motion to approve this application. Those in favour, please. Those against? The motion is carried. Lost. We now vote on whether the application should be refused. Those in favour? Those against? One. No.
So I can confirm that the item has been refused subject to the reasons in the report and the update paper.
We move on to item 4, which is Bewley, Woods Lane, Cliddesden, Basingstoke. And officers will present.
Thank you, Chairman. The application is for the erection of a 4-bedroom dwelling at Bewley, Woods Lane, Cliddesden, Basingstoke. If I could draw members' attention to the update paper, it provides the Parish Council objection, confirms no comments from the Environment Agency, makes a correction to the text of the agenda, and adds an additional condition removing permitted development rights. The recommendation is for approval subject to the completion of a legal agreement and conditions, and in the event that the legal agreement is not completed, then for refusal. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I have 4 speakers. For the objectors, Mark Capehorn, and in support, Nick Cobbold and Paul McQuilkin, and the ward councillor, Councillor Raffel. So would Mark Capehorn please come up? You will have 4 minutes, and I'll give you a minute's notice in the end.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in addition to the letters of objection and the points noted in the councillor's report, the residents would like the following to be considered. 1. In Bewley's supporting statement for the application, it quotes, "Backland development is prevalent in the area. This suggests it is already widespread, common, established and predominant. But there is no precedent set that shows a back garden development within Woods Lane, indeed Cliddesden as a whole. Guidance within the NPPF specifically encourages local planning authorities to consider the cases for setting out policies to resist inappropriate development of residential gardens, for example, where development would cause harm to the local area. The government is guiding local planning authorities to resist such development where it is harmful. The impact this application has on Cliddesden as a rural village will not mitigate the development, community or infrastructure, and most certainly not the environment. Whilst we agree in isolation this may be something the council wishes to recommend, we can only urge you to consider that this is not an isolated application. There is already one other application that is pending, and we know of others that will follow. Without doubt, this does set a precedence, and once passed, many villagers will be able to sell their back gardens and develop. 2. The highway report was conducted to validate whether the development would cause an adverse impact on highway safety. The report highlighted that an average of 920 vehicles per day go down Woods Lane, and an increase of 0.8% would arise from this development, circa 7 to 8 car movements. However, our concern is that should Bewley be used as the precedent for further backland development in Woods Lane, that this may skew the highways report and the statistics increase exponentially. Highways have also satisfied themselves that driveway splays of 43 metres looking right and 36 metres looking left are acceptable, given the speed and the usage data that they have been supplied with. However, the fact remains that Woods Lane is a 30-mile-an-hour zone, and as such requires longer splays in either direction. This clearly demonstrates a safety issue on entering and leaving the premises. We also note that the development will include some regrading of the banks to achieve the targets of 43 and 36 metres. However, as has been highlighted in the report, vegetation will grow and considerably impede the visibility for many months of the year, something regrading will not overcome. 3. The proposal mentions that there is little reference to the area in the Cliddesden design statement. In fact, there are many statements referencing Woods Lane. For example, the cluster of buildings and their construction in Woods Lane and private plots, specifically Langdown next door to Bewley, is photographed as such an example. The application is not clear as to the planting plan to ensure screening heights to protect the privacy of neighbours, nor any conditions set by the council.
1 minute to go.
Thank you. Despite section 11 of the NPPF outlining conserving and enhancing natural environment. Bewley states that the size of the dwelling has been significantly reduced to take into consideration the comments from the case officer, and we agree. However, the height of the building has only been reduced by 25 centimetres and hence still provides privacy issues for its immediate neighbours. Bewley itself will indeed be overlooked, overshadowed and lose its privacy. Finally, the situation of the driveway for the proposed dwelling runs along the hedge, and this will be a noise nuisance to neighbouring houses, including Bewley. On behalf of the residents, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Capehorn. Questions for Mr. Capehorn? No? None? Thank you, Mr. Capehorn. Now, Nick Cobbold and Paul McQuilkin, please. You have 4 minutes between you. I'll give you a minute's notice at the end.
Good evening, councillors. I'm Paul McQuilkin, the applicant this evening, and I'd like to pass you over to Nick Cobbold as agent to take you through some of the planning points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've carefully prepared what I was going to say, and I think I've been thrown a few curveballs by the objection we've just heard and by the parish council. So I'll try and knock them on the head for you if that's possible. We've worked closely with the council on this application, and after 3 applications we've got here with a positive recommendation. Firstly, the question of precedent. This, as I'm sure you've heard before, isn't a material planning consideration. Each application should be assessed on its own merits. Equally, there's no policy reason to prevent either development to the rear of existing dwellings or development in the gardens. As we just heard from the objector, the issue is one of harm. The application site is in a small character area of development on its own with the surrounding properties to the north of Woods Lane. Just further to the west, to the east, you've got the conservation area with smaller dwellings in smaller plots. The character of the area is entirely residential, generally consists of detached dwellings in various sized plots. Despite suggestions to the contrary, the property known as Appleyard really does fundamentally make a difference to this application because, by definition, it is backland development. It is to the rear of the property, Hillfield Lodge, to the front. It's served by an access down the side, very similar to what is being proposed here. The main part of our application site, in terms of a few figures for you, has an area of 690 square metres, so that's 0.7 almost, 0.07 of a hectare. The proposed dwelling will have a footprint of 149 square metres, therefore leaving 541 square metres of amenity space around it. That is a good sized plot. It actually represents a building ratio of 1 to 5, which is low. The 149 square metres footprint is consistent with the properties you can see on that plan up there. Appleyard, which has a recent approval for 244 square metres, Hillfield Lodge, which has a size of footprint of 155, and Bewley, 126 square metres. So the overall site, if approved, this includes Bewley, will be developed at 10 dwellings per hectare, which is very low density, even considering the various characteristics of the village. The committee will be aware, as you've just heard, of this application for the next door site at Langdale. I'll reiterate, the 2 applications are completely different. They should be assessed on their own merits. And the fact that the Langdale application isn't in front of you when it was submitted a month before this one suggests that there are a few teething problems potentially with that. It has its own planning obstacles to overcome, not least that it is right next to the conservation area. We've had a few questions raised about the highway visibility displays. I'll just quickly make the point that the visibility in each direction is based on factual data.
1 minute to go.
Thank you. Rather than the simple 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. There is a degree of flexibility in manual for streets. The development generated by the traffic will be minimal. We're talking 1 vehicle per peak hour, so 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening, and in the context of the daily movements, we're talking 1 additional movement every 2 hours. In the context of the village and surrounding area, this won't be noticed. Concerning the lack of need for homes which is being raised, this is something which worries me. We've got a woeful shortage of homes in the country, and housing delivery is one of the main issues facing planners and councillors. Whilst it only represents 1 additional dwelling, it is 1 fewer that needs to be found elsewhere. The site is defined as sustainable in a settlement boundary, and therefore the MPPS presumption in favour of sustainability should apply. On this basis, we urge you to grant planning permission. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cobbold. Any questions for the applicant and his agent? Potter.
Good evening, gentlemen. I just wanted to get a proper understanding of the area, which I don't profess to know that well, and we didn't have a site visit. But looking at the larger scale plan as against the 1 to 1250 at the moment, the dwelling that you referred to, Appleyard, adjacent to Hillfield Lodge, did you say that is in what I would describe as the backland area of Hillfield Lodge? Was that backland development when that was constructed?
Just to clarify, on the map on your plans, it's actually called Seals Mine rather than Appleyard. It changed its name at some point, but yes, it is backland by definition of being to the back, to the rear of Hillfield Lodge to the front. So it is a 2-tiered development, 1 on the front, 1 on the back.
Which is a matter of principle, I believe the planning officers have accepted.
Any more questions? Thank you both very much. Now, Councillor Mark Raffel, please. Councillor, you will have 4 minutes, and I'll give you, this time I will remember to give you a minute's warning.
For you allow me to speak, and I don't have my black eyes tonight. I'm going to make 4 brief points to you. You have to judge every application by the context. The context here is village, and the context here is houses with relatively large gardens, depending on where you live. The density that is proposed with this application, I submit, is incongruous with the village. It is extremely dense. And if you look at the widths, the comparative widths, the back garden is about 9 meters wide, and the front garden is about 9 meters wide. In other words, the same as the width of the property, which is completely incongruous with other properties in the area. So it's an intensification of development that is inconsistent with the village. And you will note from what's been said about the previous applications, they have in the past been rejected by the officers because of the incongruous siting, and I would submit that applies here too. The second reason whether I'd urge you to reject the application is by having a careful look at the upstairs design of the property. If you look at the measurements, the rooms are barely 3 meters by 3 meters. It looks like some of them might just be over 3 meters and some significantly below 3 meters in either the width or the depth, and due to cupboards. And of course, you've got the sloping roof in parts of it. If you look at the outside design from the front, and if that's right, it's simply too small. They're trying to cram in 4 bedrooms where it's just not appropriate. I mean, it's going to be a home for smaller folk by the looks of things. The third issue that I'd urge you to consider is the lack of privacy on the neighbouring plots. You've got previously there has been objection to the property to the north of it. And of course, Bewley, the bungalow at the front, would no longer be Beaulieu, a beautiful place, because it'd be looking straight out onto this property, which would be overbearing it from the behind. And so we'd urge you to object for that reason too. And the fourth issue is the highway issue. If you turn out of the drive of Bewley, you can barely see to the left. Woods Lane has a number of major traffic problems. There's regularly congestion, and increasing the volume of traffic out of that drive in itself is a further reason for objection. May not be the main reason, but it may be a further reason. So those are my 4 points. If one puts into context, it's just out of place, intensive development that is inappropriate. There's been some mention of Hillside Lodge. Hillside Lodge, the property to the left, is the lodge for Hillside. Hillside's up that lane and to the left. And that lane has been there for a significant period of time, and that's why off that lane was another property was built at some point. But that's a lane. It's not, as it were, backland development in the context of someone flogging off their back garden and then putting a driveway down the side of their house and
1 minute,
possibly having to demolish a garage in order to achieve it, which is a different context. So I'd urge you to reject this application.
Thank you, Councillor. Do I have any questions for Councillor Raffel? Thank you very much indeed. Questions to officers, members? Councillor Bound.
Thank you, Chair. Under the previous application, page 64 of 85, it was considered that the size and height of the proposed dwelling would appear unduly large, blah, blah. It's only been reduced by 25 centimetres. Are officers of the opinion that this is a great enough reduction in size then to overcome the previous objection? 70 centimetres, I believe, in another direction.
I think the height is one element of the application that's changed. So, as you say, the height's changed. The amount of development has also changed in terms of its width, and also having a separate detached garage. And in scope of that, in having those changes in mind, and also the consequential change of the impact on the existing boundary treatment, which is to be retained, which wasn't the case for the previous application, and also the scope to include landscaping here to soften the impact, the recommendation has changed to that of approval. I should note as well that the previous application had a objection from the landscape officer, but with the changes now allowing the retention of the landscaping and the possibility of new landscaping, the landscape officer for this scheme has no objection.
Any more questions for officers? And we'll go into debate. Does anybody have any comments to make or proposals to put? Ghastly silence. Councillor Mrs. Tucker.
Just to get it off the ground, I shall move the recommendation, Mr. Chairman.
I have Councillor Potter.
Well, I was conscious of the fact I probably speak too much too often, but I was going to do the same, but I'm happy to second that. And in saying that, I mean, I support the officer's interpretation of the application. Simple as that, really. And I think it's been analysed correctly. And there's always a problem in respect of backland development, but the arguments around precedent, we're reminded of that, really. I mean, we consider each application on its own merit, and that's what I'd like to do on this occasion. And I think it's worthy of support. I'm happy to second Councillor Tucker.
Thank you. Are there any more comments from anyone? No? Right, I have a proposal to recommend that it be approved. Those in favour? Those against? Motion is carried.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to confirm that the decision is for permission, subject to the completion of the legal agreement, and in the event that the legal agreement isn't completed, then for refusal. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Now we move on to item number 5, Bearview, London Road, Wells in the Field, Whitchurch. And I will ask officers to give their presentation. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Chairman. Item number 5 is for the erection of a 2-storey side extension and alterations to existing conservatory to form habitable accommodation at Bearview, London Road, Wells in the Field, Whitchurch. Members are drawn to, their attention should be drawn to the update in which it documents the details of the viewing panel, and the recommendation for this is that the application be refused.
Thank you. I have one speaker, Mr. Sampson. In support? You have 4 minutes, Mr. Sampson, and I'll give you a reminder when there's one left.
Thank you very much, Chairman and councillors, for hearing this presentation. I'm very pleased that the councillors visited the site last week, and what I would like to do very briefly is to say that we believe that this extension is designed within the scale and the bulk of the existing dwelling. During the planning process, alterations were carried out to the design to make it more acceptable to the next door neighbour, and to give it a slightly less appearance than originally. The ground footprint of the extension is only marginally increased because the work involves the dismantling of the existing almost derelict garage. The neighbouring property to the west, which you can see shown yellow on that photograph, is very close to our applicant's boundary and has a 2-storey extension which was previously approved by this council and is of a greater bulk and is considered more disproportionate than the application before you. The proposed application will, we believe, greatly enhance the overall symmetry of the design of the applicant's property. The view, as you can see from that photograph there, the view between the properties is presently obscured by the hedge, by the next door neighbour's extension, and by that significant tree. And we believe that there will be very little that is available to be seen by passing traffic, and also from the conservation area across the road, due to the height of the property above the road and certainly above the conservation area. The view to the east of the applicant's property is very important, and this has been left totally clear because the applicant is very aware of the fact that their view is one of a line of a short line of properties, and there are some properties which have very little view and others which have a large view. So the eastern view is left open. The opposition from the conservation officer is well-meaning, in our opinion, but in this case we consider it not adequately valid. The conservation area commences south of London Road and is some 4 metres or more below the front edge of the property. Other viewing points from the conservation area itself are at such extreme distances that the proposed extension would arguably not even been seen from the conservation area or from the mill in the distance.
1 minute to go.
Yes. Public observation has highlighted opinions of overshadowing and infilling of the gap, but what we would say is that the objection has been dealt with, and the sight lines to the northwest of the objector's view has been addressed, which we believe to be satisfactory. We hope that the committee in their site meeting has considered the very small impact of this extension, and the family have asked me on their behalf to express a wish that this application is granted so that they can have further family accommodation for their growing children. And thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Sampson. Do I have questions for Mr. Sampson, please? No? Thank you, Mr. Sampson. Questions to officers? No? Debate? Councillor Bound.
I'll start off. I'm sure other people have got other things to say. I did go on the site visit, and I'm sorry, I have come to the conclusion that my views are entirely opposite to those of the officer report in terms of the recommendation for refusal. I think that the extension would be subservient. It would respect the visual amenity of the area, and I can't see any adverse effect on the conservation area. So I'm afraid my views are somewhat contrary to the officers.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
I think I'd just like to agree with Councillor Bound. All I've got to say is it just looks like a perfectly reasonable proposal to me that isn't going to impinge on anybody or on the street scene.
Any other comments? Councillor Tucker.
I'm not sure. I should know. What concerns me is the distance between the two properties. That, I mean, it's a very small distance in the neighbouring one to the fence, and this again will be even smaller. Is this legally possible that they can do that? Because there was a crack down the neighbouring house that we noticed, and they got stuff in the guttering. And I'm just wondering, how do you just have to be friendly with your neighbours to be able to get ladders up and that sort of stuff?
In terms of actually constructing the extension to the proposed dwelling, provided that they do so without actually accessing the neighbour's land, then they can do so in planning terms. If any damage were to be created to the neighbour's property, that would be entirely a private matter between them and the neighbour.
Councillor Potter.
It really is, just bear with me really, just to support of what's been said. I mean, I always hesitate putting forward the proposal because I get lumbered with having to describe the reasons. I'm trying to not get into that again tonight if I can avoid it. But certainly I was dismayed, I think, really, if I'm truthful with you, when we saw it, to see what the officers were saying on this occasion. And it really was an attempt, and it's been modified, as the applicant's representative said, to be empathetic, I think, with the host building. I didn't find it out of scale at all. And I think in terms of the observations about the conservation area, I mean, we know it's not within the conservation area. And when we looked up and down the row of houses, it's a fairly sort of disparate, or whatever the right word is, group of houses. And really I hesitate with these words really, but the aesthetic merit of them varies, let's put it like that. And this, I think, will enhance this building, will balance it, I think, really, when I looked at the proposal. So to that extent, I see it as an approval. And if somebody else is prepared to go for approval, I'll certainly second it. And I'm happy to talk in negative, to change the reasons that the officers have put forward here. We need to do that really, but I think we're at one on this. I think we were expressing it quietly in our own way and continue to do so tonight, really.
Councillor Frost.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a belated question to officers that unfortunately I wasn't able to make the viewing panel, for which I truly apologise, but I did actually do a drive-by through Whitchurch on a route to many of my customers from the Basingstoke area. So I have actually been past here. From what I've seen from the plans, I can't see this being disproportionate. So could somebody please explain to me why you think it is? Thank you.
I think when you consider the footprint of the original dwelling and the extension that's already been approved on the side, it was considered that the cumulative effects of having another large side extension would increase the bulk of the property to a level that was unacceptable and be out of character with the character of the properties in the area, albeit there was a sort of mixed variety of dwellings there. I think that was the main issues.
Thank you. But you said it's a mixed bag of properties, or it was deemed as being not being too in keeping with the rest of the properties. But down that road, I don't think there's a single one design of property. It's a real mixed bag. It's a real, well, in my industry they say it's a real bag of spanners down there. So what I'm seeing here is a proportionate extension which has been modified, to take into consideration objections from the neighbours. So I'm still, at a loss as to why it's been, that this matter is being recommended for refusal.
I think if I can just try and give some background to it. There is planning history here. The application was previously refused. Obviously, members are entirely entitled to take a different viewpoint. A couple of points. The existing dwelling has already been extended to one side. Obviously, this officer's views that the extension that's now proposed is disproportionate in terms of its size. As I said, although I appreciate the members can take a different view on that, as they're entitled to do so. But when you look at both extensions in context of the original dwelling house, it's quite a substantial increase in terms of the size. And the other part to the reason for refusal isn't just about the proportion; it's about the loss of space about the dwelling and closing that gap and the spaciousness that would create for the dwelling on the plot.
Sorry, Chair, if I can just come back, but you can see from the photograph here that you can't actually see the space. I mean, I'm struggling to understand what loss of space you can have. the conservation area is below the level. It's heavily shielded. I'm really struggling to understand this.
The spaciousness is in effect created by the gap between the dwellings. So here it's that vertical sky component that you see exactly where the roof would be going that would lose the spaciousness between the two dwellings.
Sorry, Pan, just one final question. And that is considered important?
Yes, it's considered important to the character of the street scene and the spaciousness that there is kind of the rhythm of the street scene has properties with some space about them to at least one side.
Councillor Bound.
Yes, Chair, I was going to move approval actually.
Thank you. We had a seconder, but not a mover.
With reasons like it would be subservient, it would respect the visual amenity of the area, and it doesn't have any adverse effect on the conservation area.
Thank you. We have a motion to approve this application. Those in favour? Those against? The motion is carried. So, conditions?
Yeah, so the suggested conditions would be that the development was built in accordance with the approved plans, that there would be a time limit for the works to commence of 3 years, that materials would match the existing dwelling, and that permitted development rights would be removed so that no first floor windows could be inserted in the side elevation without plan permission being sought and granted.
Thank you. Right, we have move on to item number 6, which is Vodafone installation of a multiband antennas, which I'll move from the chair. Do I have a seconder?
Second.
Thank you. Those in favour? Carried. Thank you. Thank you all. That's it, I think, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you all very much. And thank you for the few extra dimes we've had and the good humour which we've carried them out with. Thank you.